Mogadishu in January 1975 was a city holding its breath. The capital was tightly locked down under strict military rule, and speaking out of turn carried heavy consequences. At the top of this system sat President Mohamed Siad Barre. His military regime operated a massive intelligence apparatus, the National Security Service, establishing nearly total surveillance over the daily lives of citizens. To secure weapons and funding, Barre aligned his government with Leonid Brezhnev and the Soviet Union. Under this alliance, Somalia officially adopted scientific socialism as its organizing state ideology. The Somali government began completely restructuring society. They built up massive state forces and mandated top-down economic and political controls, directly mirroring the heavy-handed Soviet approach. The regime wanted to prove their absolute commitment to Marxist principles. To do that, they targeted a cornerstone of the culture that even previous European colonial powers had deliberately avoided: Islamic family law. Barre's government operated on a specific assumption. They believed that state-enforced socialist ideology, backed by the threat of military violence, could overwrite centuries of deep-rooted religious tradition. On January 11, 1975, the state made its move. The government publicly announced the Hirka Koiska, a new family law. The immediate reaction across the nation was complete silence. The National Security Service was too feared for anyone to openly question the decree. But a group of 10 religious scholars recognized that this specific law crossed a divine boundary. They made the decision to break the public silence and protest the measure. In 1970s Somalia, speaking out against state policy meant confronting a heavily armed dictatorship head-on. On January 23, 1975, at the police academy in Mogadishu, a firing squad carried out an execution. As the shots rang out, 2 MiG-17 fighter jets suddenly collided in the sky overhead. The 10 men tied to the posts below were not military rebels or foreign spies. They were among the most prominent Islamic scholars in Somalia. Their deaths marked the end of a brief 12-day standoff between a secular military government and the country's religious establishment. This clash of authorities severed the trust between the state and its people. Scholars knew their protest carried a near-certain death sentence. To understand why this law was so explosive, we have to look at its core intent. The 1975 family law mandated absolute state-enforced equality between men and women in the domestic sphere. This diagram shows how the new law worked in practice. It instituted a strict 50-50 split for familial inheritance and mandated that men and women share equal financial maintenance responsibilities for the household. But as the graphic recalculates, traditional Sharia law operates differently. Under Quranic text, inheritance distributions and maintenance obligations are strictly and mathematically defined based on specific gender roles and familial duties, directly contradicting the socialist mandate. Beyond the math, the law executed a massive power grab. It removed ultimate legal authority over marriage, divorce, and inheritance from traditional Islamic courts, placing all of that power directly into the hands of the secular state. Across the Muslim-majority world, family law is fiercely protected. While criminal and civil codes often adopt Western models, family law is widely considered the final stronghold of Sharia against creeping secularization. The government sold the mandate as a necessary step toward modernization and equality. Religious scholars, however, saw a direct violation of Quranic principles, an act of open apostasy designed to dismantle the sacred structure of the Muslim family. On January 16, 1975, the tension broke. Speaking from the pulpit of the Abdul Qadir Mosque in Mogadishu, the scholars publicly and fiercely condemned the new law. The regime responded immediately. The National Security Service swept through the city, arresting the scholars along with hundreds of activists and sympathizers. Over the next few days, the state held rapid, closed-door proceedings at the National Security Court to ensure swift convictions for the organizers. On January 23rd, the tragedy reached its peak. The 10 prominent scholars were tied to stakes at the Mogadishu Police Academy and executed by a military firing squad. The regime's calculus was brutal and straightforward. By shedding the blood of revered holy men, they intended to terrify the broader public into permanent ideological submission. The executions achieved the exact opposite of what Barre intended. Instead of securing compliance, the violence deeply alienated the Somali public. Women and families quietly boycotted the new regulations. They simply refused to bring their domestic disputes to state courts because the secular laws violated their core religious beliefs. The state-enforced equality also had unintended social consequences. By disrupting traditional support structures without community buy-in, the law inadvertently led to severe spikes in domestic violence and divorce. The political fallout lasted for decades. The executions of the 10 scholars birthed the modern Somali Islamist movement, directly fracturing Bare's grip on power and setting the stage for organized opposition. Totalitarian violence proved completely ineffective at changing the private spiritual convictions of the Somali people. The regime could control the streets, but they could not control the family. This model illustrates a concept by legal theorist Roscoe Pound. He argued that state laws only function successfully when they interlock with the inherent cultural and religious values of the society they attempt to regulate. Because the 1975 decree lacked that structural support, it eventually collapsed. The socialist family law was totally abandoned. Today, modern Somalia has reverted fully to Sharia law for all matters of marriage, divorce, and inheritance. A state can rewrite the text of a civil code, and it can execute those who refuse to comply, but it can never legislate away a people's faith. At the police academy in Mogadishu, a firing squad carried out an execution. As the shots rang out, 2 MiG-17 fighter jets suddenly collided in the sky overhead. The 10 men tied to the posts below were not military rebels or foreign spies. They were among the most prominent Islamic scholars in Somalia. Their deaths marked the end of a brief 12-day standoff between a secular military government and the country's religious establishment. This clash of authorities severed the trust between the state and its people, creating an ideological fracture that laid the groundwork for modern extremism in the Horn of Africa. 6 years earlier, in October 1969, General Mohammed Siad Barre seized control of the country in a bloodless military coup, promising to eliminate corruption and modernize the economy. To secure military and financial backing from the Soviet Union, Barre declared the nation a socialist state. He introduced a guiding ideology called scientific socialism to reorganize government and manage production. The implementation of this imported secular doctrine faced an immediate barrier. Somali society was deeply anchored in Islamic traditions that had shaped the region's laws and culture since the year 632. While Barre promoted the image of a classless, equal society, he maintained his grip on power through a covert network of clan loyalties known as the Mod system, heavily favoring his own Marahan clan and its allies. The state was demanding total allegiance to a secular framework while operating on exclusionary tribal lines within a population defined by its faith. The pressure was building. The conflict ignited on January 11, 1975, when Barre announced a sweeping new family law during a speech at a Mogadishu stadium. This academic paper evaluates those socialist reforms, which included new statutes granting equal inheritance rights to men and women. These provisions directly contravened explicit texts within the Quran regarding the division of property. Initial public reaction was cautious. The regime had built an extensive intelligence apparatus, and citizens knew that vocal opposition carried severe risks. The silence broke 5 days later. From the pulpit of the Abdul Qadir Mosque, a prominent jurist named Sheikh Ahmed Sheikh Mohammed delivered a sermon publicly condemning the government for violating Islamic law. Other clerics quickly joined the protest. It was an overt challenge to the government's authority and a direct rejection of Barre's modernization agenda. Barre's retaliation was immediate. Security and military forces swept through the capital, detaining the outspoken scholars along with hundreds of activists and sympathizers. The accused were stripped of civilian legal protections and placed before the National Security Court for a trial that lasted only 2 days. The sentences were staggering. 17 people received 20 years in prison, 6 received 30 years, and 10 prominent scholars were sentenced to death. The regime had spent years broadcasting its vision of an enlightened, progressive republic, but the speed and severity of this tribunal exposed its total reliance on brute force to maintain control. By executing the clerics rather than negotiating, the government eliminated its vocal critics, but immortalized them in the minds of the public. The firing squad silenced public protests, pushing opposition underground. In secret circles, a highly motivated resistance formed among the youth. Citizens who had previously tolerated the military government were deeply alienated. The executions fueled widespread panic that Bare's ultimate goal was to force atheism upon the population. This historical document details how one early resistance group, Jamaat Ahlul Islam, saw a massive influx of new adherents directly following the executions. What began as study circles advocating for a return to traditional Islamic values gradually militarized, adopting rigid, exclusionary doctrines in direct response to the state's violence. Forcefully erasing centuries of religious tradition provided the fuel needed to ignite organized, violent extremism. Over the next decade, the regime's control deteriorated entirely. By January 1991, Siad Barre was forced to flee Mogadishu as the state collapsed into civil war. In the fractured landscape that followed, the militant ideologies seeded in the 1970s found room to grow, eventually coalescing into heavily armed insurgencies like al-Shabaab. Today, the federal government of Somalia applies Sharia law to all family matters. The secular statutes that cost 10 men their lives were completely erased. The state tried engineering a modern society by suppressing its foundational beliefs. Under that intense pressure, the entire structure shattered. You cannot rewrite a nation's cultural DNA at gunpoint. When a government executes its critics to enforce an ideology, it rarely secures its future. It simply arms the forces that will tear it apart.